Week 3 of the NFL season is in the books, and it's time for Week 4 waivers. But before we get to this week's top waiver wire targets, let's look back on my picks from Week 3 and see which ones we got right and which picks might have missed the mark. Starting with running backs, my picks for Week 3 were J.D. McKissic, Cordarrelle Patterson, and Sony Michel. McKissic was surprisingly not very involved for Washington, even though they trailed for the entire game, only touching the ball 5 times against the Bills, resulting in 23 yards on 3 carries and 2 catches for 15 yards. Scoring just 4.8 fantasy points in Week 3, McKissic is someone that still should be rostered, but is purely an emergency play until we see him more consistently involved in the Washington offense. Meanwhile, Cordarrelle Patterson continued to eat into the workload of Mike Davis in Atlanta, rushing 7 times for 20 yards, while catching 6 of 7 targets for 82 yards in the Falcons' win over the Giants on Sunday, totaling over 14.5 fantasy points in the process. Patterson looks like the player to own in the Atlanta backfield, and because of his pass-catching prowess, has significant rest-of-season value in PPR leagues. Go pick him up if he's still available. Our final RB pick in Week 3, Sony Michel was the workhorse for the Rams this week as expected, rushing 20 times for 67 yards, while also catching 3 passes for another 12 yards through the air. Good for a boring but solid 9.4 fantasy points. As long as Darrell Henderson remains out for LA, Michel will be a low-end RB2 and a high-end flex play for fantasy purposes. Moving on to quarterbacks, my picks for Week 3 were Teddy Bridgewater, Derek Carr, and Daniel Jones. Bridgewater's Broncos beat up on the hopeless Jets in Week 3, shutting out New York 26-0. With both running backs running hot for Denver, Teddy wasn't asked to do all that much, completing 19 of 25 passes for just 235 yards, with no touchdowns and no turnovers, totaling just 11.8 fantasy points. Bridgewater's final stat line was disappointing for fantasy owners, who saw the Jets as a juicy matchup for the double-gloved field general, but Teddy should have to throw much more in a Week 4 matchup against Baltimore, whose defense is built to stop the run. My next QB pick was Derek Carr, who continued a scorching hot start to the season by throwing for 386 yards with 2 touchdowns and 1 interception in the Raiders' Week 3 win over the Dolphins, scoring over 25 fantasy points and leading Las Vegas to an undefeated 3-0 start. Carr is an every week QB1 and should be rostered and started in all leagues until further notice. Our last Week 3 QB pick was New York Giants quarterback Daniel Jones. In a soft matchup versus the Atlanta Falcons, Jones was rather pedestrian, rarely looking downfield while throwing for 266 scoreless yards in the Giants' 3rd straight loss to open the season. Jones saved his otherwise awful fantasy day with his legs, finishing with 16.5 fantasy points thanks to his 39 yards on 8 carries and a rushing score. Looking back at our Week 3 wide receiver picks, none of our 3 targets were fantasy viable, and worse still, one left with an injury and did not return. After 2 great weeks to start the season, Minnesota wide receiver KJ Osborne saw just 2 targets in Week 3, catching both for 26 scoreless yards. New York Giants wide receiver Darius Slayton left the game versus the Falcons due to a hamstring injury, catching just 1 pass for 8 yards before exiting, and Detroit wide receiver Quintus Cephas was nearly invisible for the Lions, also catching just 1 pass for 8 yards and only playing on 71% of the offensive snaps for Detroit in Week 3, after playing 89% of the Lions' offensive snaps last week versus Green Bay. Like my wide receiver picks, my Week 3 tight end picks also struggled to produce points. Outside of Cleveland tight end Austin Hooper, who scored a touchdown, neither Max Williams or Jack Doyle were very involved in Week 3, and could both struggle to hold season-long value as the likely 4th or 5th options in their respective passing attacks. My struggles continued on defense, as my picks for Week 3 proved useless outside of the Carolina Panthers. While disappointing, we learn, adjust, and move forward. In total, just 6 of my 15 Week 3 picks were usable in fantasy, and hopefully Week 4 brings a bit better luck and a lot more fantasy points. Let's get right to it. As always, we start with the running backs. The hottest name on waivers will undoubtedly be Carolina Panthers rookie Chuba Hubbard, who will be filling in for an injured Christian McCaffrey until the star is fully healthy. After McCaffrey went down with the hamstring injury in Week 3, Hubbard was thrust into action, rushing 11 times for 52 yards, while catching 3 of his 5 targets for another 27 yards through the air, totaling 9.4 fantasy points in mop-up duty for Carolina. With McCaffrey likely to miss a few weeks, Hubbard is set to inherit a sizable workload and is this week's top ad, with a trip to Jerry World to face the Dallas Cowboys up next in Week 4. Other waiver wire running backs to consider ahead of Week 4 include Peyton Barber, Zach Moss, and Demetric Felton. Barber surprisingly has been the lead back for the Raiders, filling in for injured starter Josh Jacobs. A Gruden favorite for reasons unknown, Barber was miserable as a runner for Washington in 2020, averaging just 2.7 yards per carry prior to his release this summer. In Vegas, Barber looks like a completely different player, displaying shiftiness and burst previously absent from the veterans' game. In Week 3, Barber went full beast mode, handling 23 carries and rushing for 111 yards and a score against the Dolphins while adding 3 catches for 31 yards. While most assumed the Raiders would turn to Kenyon Drake, the league's highest-paid backup running back, to fill in for Jacobs, Barber has made doubters such as myself eat a substantial amount of crow after out-touching Drake 39-22 in Weeks 2 and 3. Barber is the Raiders' backup running back to own, and could be in line for another hefty workload if Jacobs is again inactive for Monday Night Showdown versus the Los Angeles Chargers. Our last running back to target for Week 4 is Cleveland Browns rookie Demetric Felton. A hybrid running back and wide receiver, Felton is used all over the field for Cleveland, seeing time in the backfield, in the slot, and in the return game. With Browns wide receiver Jarvis Landry unlikely to play in Week 4, Felton could be a sneaky play in deeper leagues, with a shootout versus the Vikings on tap for Cleveland. Leading the list of Week 3 QB ads, Derek Carr is one of my top targets on the waiver wire in consecutive weeks. Playing at an MVP level, the underrated signal caller leads the league in passing yards, throwing for over 1,200 yards in just 3 games. Averaging over 400 yards passing per contest, Carr has the Raiders running on all cylinders, and with a Monday night matchup versus Justin Herbert and the Chargers, look for Carr to continue his red-hot start to the season in a game that should feature plenty of offense. Other QB streamers to consider for Week 4 include Sam Darnold, Taylor Heinicke, and Jameis Winston. Panthers QB Sam Darnold is another early season MVP candidate, leading Carolina to a 3-0 start while racking up 6 total touchdowns to just 2 turnovers in the first 3 weeks. With star running back Christian McCaffrey out nursing a hamstring injury, expect the Panthers to lean more on Darnold this week in a likely shootout versus the Cowboys in Dallas. Taylor Heinicke was up and down in the first road start of his career in Washington's Week 3 blowout loss against the Bills, completing just 58% of his passes and throwing 2 bad interceptions on a windy day in Buffalo. On the flip side, Bud Heinicke tossed a pair of passing touchdowns and did some damage as a runner, adding 21 yards and another score on 8 carries. Sunday's matchup with the Falcons in Atlanta looks to be much easier on paper, and Heinicke could be primed for a big performance in a game Washington desperately needs to keep pace in the NFC East. Jameis Winston has also been up and down in his return to a starting role, failing to throw for 150 yards in each of the Saints' first 3 games. But it hasn't all been bad for the former number 1 overall pick, as Winston has scored 8 total touchdowns with just 2 turnovers so far this season. Streaming the old crab-leg bandit certainly isn't for the faint of heart, but bold owners could eat some serious W's as the Saints get ready to host the 0-3 Giants this Sunday, then face the struggling defense of Washington in Week 5 before New Orleans goes on bye. Figuring out which Jameis shows up on a weekly basis is anyone's guess, so play the polarizing passer at your own peril. Next up, we're looking at wide receivers, and another Raider leads the list. Las Vegas second-year wideout Henry Ruggs is a top target for Week 4. Owned in just 50% of Yahoo leagues, Ruggs is somehow still flying under the radar. The speedster from Alabama is one of the league's best deep threats, currently averaging an otherworldly 24 yards per catch, snagging 11 of his 15 targets for 267 yards and a touchdown through 3 weeks. With Derek Carr playing at an elite level for the Raiders and taking tons of shots downfield, Ruggs is someone for fantasy owners to target heavily on waivers this week, and should provide weekly flex value going forward. Another Raider worthy of flex consideration, Hunter Renfrow has been the most consistent receiver in Vegas. With 22 targets through 3 weeks, Renfrow is a stable option in PPR leagues and clearly has the trust of Carr and the coaching staff in this apparently high-powered Raiders offense. Buffalo Bills wide receiver Emmanuel Sanders is another popular ad for Week 4. Owned in just 27% of Yahoo leagues, Sanders spiked twice against Washington, and the veteran continues to flirt with flex value in the Bills' high-volume passing attack. A matchup against the terrible Texans defense awaits in Week 4, so go get Sanders while you still can. If you're looking for a dart throw with touchdown potential for Week 4, look no further than Packers wide receiver Marquez Valdes-Scantling. Scantling is a big play waiting to happen, and last week had a 47-yard grab to go with a 12-yard score, and the Packers win against the 49ers. Aaron Rodgers continues to take shots to the speedster downfield, and while they mostly have been unable to connect thus far, I expect MVS to finally snag a long touchdown versus a struggling Steelers team in Week 4. This week's top target at tight end is Dallas Cowboys veteran Dalton Schultz. The 4th-year tight end broke out in a big way in 2020, catching 63 passes for 615 yards and 4 touchdowns, filling in for an injured Blake Jarwin. With Jarwin healthy this season, many assumed Schultz would be brushed to the side, but the former fourth-rounder from Stanford had other plans. Owned in just 4% of Yahoo leagues, Schultz has played 70% of the Cowboys' snaps this season, compared to just 54% for Jarwin. In Week 3, Schultz made the case for more opportunities, catching 6 of 7 targets for 80 yards and 2 touchdowns in the Cowboys' Monday night victory against NFC East rival Philadelphia. Schultz looks like the clear tight end one in Dallas, and could have another chance for a big game this week when the undefeated Panthers travel to Texas. With Carolina's defense likely to bring constant pressure, Schultz should continue to work as Dak Prescott's safety valve over the middle of the field, and is a weekly tight end 2 with upside moving forward. Other tight ends to consider for Week 4 waivers include Tyler Conklin, Dawson Knox, and Tommy Tremble. Conklin caught 7 of 8 targets for 70 yards and a score in Week 3, after back-to-back 4-target games to start the season. Conklin's spike in production seems to directly correlate with slot receiver KJ Osborne's lack of Week 3 usage, and the two could trade off usable weeks as the number 3 and 4 options in the Minnesota passing attack. Conklin is squarely a tight end 2, but could provide some value to owners desperate for tight end production if they are willing to play the weekly touchdown guessing game. Buffalo Bills tight end Dawson Knox is another touchdown-dependent option for owners willing to take a risk, scoring in back-to-back games, but averaging just 3 targets and 36 yards receiving per game. Dawson is an attractive choice this week for tight end needy owners, as the Bills play host to a terrible Texans team in Week 4. A sleeper choice usually reserved for the deepest of dynasty leagues, Carolina Panthers rookie Tommy Tremble is now firmly on the fantasy radar as a player to watch. After failing to catch a pass in his first 2 games as a pro, the versatile chess piece burst onto the scene with a highlight 30-yard grab, as well as scoring a 7-yard rushing touchdown in the Panthers' Week 3 win against the Houston Texans. With Carolina shipping starting tight end Dan Arnold to Jacksonville for help in the secondary, Tremble steps into a great opportunity this week against Dallas as the rookie looks to build off last week's performance. The top streaming defense to target for Week 4 is the New Orleans Saints. Averaging an incredible 14.3 fantasy points per game through 3 weeks, New Orleans gets a matchup with the 0-3 Giants and their turnover-prone quarterback Daniel Jones in Week 4. Allowing just 14 points per game, with 6 sacks, 6 interceptions, 2 block kicks, multiple fourth-down stops, and a defensive touchdown, the New Orleans defense could turn their Week 4 matchup into an absolute nightmare for New York. Other streaming defenses to target for Week 4 include the Cincinnati Bengals, the Green Bay Packers, and the Indianapolis Colts. All 3 teams are facing struggling offenses in Week 4 and could provide that extra boost to your fantasy team's baseline this week. Who are your top waiver adds for Week 4? How many of these players will produce in fantasy lineups this week? Let me know in the comment section below, and don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already for more NFL content just like this.